Hello, everyone. Welcome, 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 welcome. Symposium day 2, the research day, just to let everyone know that this is being recorded and we are also live on YouTube, which is fantastic. It's so lovely to see you all again today, even though this is a fully virtual session. I'm just so excited to see all of you here today, and so excited to hear all of the exciting presentations that we will have for today, the research day. I'm hesitant to say that, this is my favorite day of the symposium after how absolutely incredible yesterday was. All the panelists, some that are on the call here today, Dalton, Anita, Cecilia, Kaelyn, obviously. Big, massive thank you to all of you for yesterday's panels. Chef's kiss, absolutely phenomenal. Thank you so much. So research day, again, as I say, probably one of my favorite days, just to get to see all of the work that we have been doing in the writing groups, in the study sessions, everything that we are so used to talking about in the abstract coming into the forefront today, and for us to share all of the exciting bits of research that we are doing. It is so lovely to see a full house here today as well. Just so excited. Yeah. The Accepted Research Day has been something that we have been working towards for the last 3 years in the symposium. And every single year that we do this, every single research presentation that happens is always just so phenomenal. I know I use that word a lot, but it truly is to see the extent and diversity of the work that our members do. It's so difficult when we get our research proposals to be able to pull them together into like themes or things like that, because of the diversity of the work that is being done. But at the same time, that is what we want in the research day. We want everyone here and everyone that's on the live stream to be able to look at the research that is being done today and say, you know what, there's something in there that actually is kind of similarly related to, or vaguely related to what I am doing in my research. And I think it is that part of the research day that just makes the day so phenomenal. So I'll stop rambling. Without further ado, let us get into the program. I'm very excited. I want to do a massive shout out to Cecilia. Everyone around here, give a massive applause to Cecilia for all her hard work on preparing the program, working with everyone to get their presentations up and running, and just could not have done today without you, Cecilia. So thank you so much. Big round of applause. All right, should we get in? So just wanted to let you guys know the format for today. We will have 3 presentations that are all sort of under similar themes, and then they'll all be 5 minutes or 5-ish minutes, giving all of us a little bit of leniency. And then at the end of those 3 presentations, we will take a 10 to 15 minute question and answer session for our presenters. So that is the plan. Let us kick off. I believe I'm the first to present. I would ask everyone here to go really easy on me. This is my first time ever presenting any academic related work, and if anyone's wondering, like, Kaelyn and everyone are like literally right over here in the day. So we're all in the same room, just connected via different devices. So just, yeah, go real easy on me. Let me get myself set up and we'll kick off. Oh, this is going to be fun. Actually, Cecilia, can I ask you to present my my recording? I think it might just be a bit easier than me trying to navigate. I can't hear the presentation. I don't know if that's just me. I know, can you hear the presentation on your side?
Cecilia, you're gonna have to go back to sharing. So end the sharing and then in Zoom, and you just need to make sure that you say share sound as well as sharing the screen.
Hello all, my name is Kate. I'm a master's student in literature and arts at the University of Oxford, and this is my first academic presentation based on a research paper that I submitted for my master's. So this paper builds on the seminal work of Roy Strong, who discusses the importance of semiotics within Elizabeth's portraits. I, however, expand this argument to include Catherine McCormack's brilliant book, Woman in the Picture, which builds on the work of Linda Nochlin and John Berger, emphasizing the pervasive influence of the male gaze. McCormack argues specifically that women's bodies have historically been portrayed and perceived differently from men's, often framed within archetypes like the virginal maid and the obedient mother. This lens is crucial for understanding Elizabeth's portraits, as they were created by male artists and intended for a predominantly male audience to convince them of her authority. As such, my analysis of Elizabeth's portraits employ a semiotic approach, identifying symbols and themes in the art and literature that reflect gendered assumptions, and whether these assumptions differ from those transposed on Elizabeth as the traditional Virgin Queen portrayal that we have all come to know. In this presentation, I'll be looking at two key portraits, the Sieve portrait and the Armada portrait. The Sieve portrait, or the Siena portrait, by Quentin Metzi the Younger, circa 1583, portrays Elizabeth holding a sieve, an emblem of chastity derived from the Roman Vestal Virgin Tuccia. This symbol underscores the narrative that Elizabeth's monarchical power is rooted in her virginity. The sieve, which is filled with water, alludes to Tuccia's miraculous proof of her chastity, that she can carry the sieve and not spill the water, which reinforces Elizabeth's purity and suitability as a ruler. Furthermore, Elizabeth's attire in the portrait is meticulously designed to emphasize her virginity and femininity. Pearls, the symbol of purity and wealth, adorn her dress and are strategically placed to draw attention to her breasts and the busk point, directing the viewer's gaze ultimately towards her sexual organs and the sieve imagery. The busk point, in particular, is a design for female gowns which are meant to protect the sexual organ. The reoccurring V-shapes in her dress highlight her sexuality, and the color scheme of black representing consistency and white representing virginity further reinforces this image. The portrait also includes imperial symbols such as the column depicting Dido and Aeneas and the terrestrial globe that flank her on either side, suggesting Elizabeth's role in founding and ruling an empire. The emphasis remains on her virginity and chastity as the source of this power, as is seen in the horizontal and vertical lines that intersect at her breast and to the sieve. In a similar way, the Armada portrait commemorate the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 portrays Elizabeth in a grand ornate dress, symbolizing her triumph and expansion of the British Empire. The background scenes depict the English fleet's victory, reinforcing this imperial power. However, Elizabeth's dress, compared to the Civ portrait, is richly adorned with pearls, jewels, and ribbons, symbolizing her wealth and maternal care for the nation. The busk point, again adorned with a pendant and a ribbon, signifies her status as a virgin queen that is devoted to her empire. That busk point is never removed in any of her portraits. Her upright posture and the stiffness of her attire furthermore emphasize her regal bearing and adherence to contemporary ideals of feminine beauty and virtue. The fact that her corset or her busk does not allow her to move evidences ideals of society at the time. The portrait reflects Elizabeth's understanding of the importance of courtly magnificence as a representation of her rule. Her dress and demeanor set an example for her courtiers, promoting a narrative of chivalric love and loyalty that connects her feminine body to the masculine realm of political power. This is also represented in Edmund Spenser's iconic work, The Faerie Queene. The allegorical epic contains various female characters that represent different aspects of Elizabeth's persona. Characters like Gloriana, who is the ruler of fairyland, and Britomart, who is the knight of chastity, all illustrate the duality of female sexuality as both a virtue and a vice. Chastity is celebrated as a virtue in characters like Belle Phoebe, while sexuality is depicted as a threat in characters like Jewessa. Spenser's portrayal of Artingyle, for instance, is very, very telling. Artingyle is humiliated by being dressed in woman's clothing and performing feminine tasks, which reflect society's anxieties about female authority. This narrative underscores the necessity for Elizabeth to project an image of power and status that transcends traditional feminine roles while still maintaining that perceived femininity. Spenser's work reinforces the idea that Elizabeth's chastity and controlled sexuality are central to her authority. Characters like Britomart, who adopt male clothing and material prowess, highlight the tension between feminine power and social expectations. Despite this, Elizabeth is portrayed as the exceptional female sovereign whose virtue and chastity actually legitimize her rule. So, in conclusion, Elizabeth's portraits and literary representations underscore her sexuality as a central aspect of her authority. This emphasis on her virginity and maternal qualities was not merely about her marital status, but was a strategic performance that legitimized her power in a patriarchal society. This narrative reflected both her awareness and strategic use of her image, not only in these portraits, but in the accounts that are provided for her, and remains influential in understanding the intersection of gender, power, and art. This analysis in particular reveals how deeply embedded notions of female sexuality shape our perceptions of historical and contemporary female figures. And by re-examining Elizabeth's portraits through a feminist lens, we can gain a more nuanced understanding of her reign and the cultural significance of her imagery. This approach challenges traditional interpretations and highlights the importance of considering gender and performance in the study of history and art. Thank you so much.
All right, everyone. Thank you very much for your support. We will move on to the next presentation, which is Ashley's presentation. I believe this is also pre-recorded and needs to be shared.
I don't have Ashley's presentation.
Oh, 1 second. I think I have it. Just give me a sec. In the meantime, maybe we can have Dalton, your presentation.
Can everybody see the screen? And here we go. Okay, perfect. There we go. So everybody see everything okay? It's just a PowerPoint. Perfect. I haven't done Zoom PowerPoint presentation. So this is the my presentation on economic viability of rural air mobility. And this was based off of a previous study, continuation of a previous study that was done by my research supervisors. And I asked further questions and found some further research with it. So with this, kind of a history of it. So the US airline industry was deregulated in 1978, meaning your airfares got a lot cheaper and it allowed more people to access the ability to travel. And today there's primarily 4 large operators that operate under our Essential Air Service program. That basically go to smaller cities that are subsidized heavily. The subsidy adds up to $493 million a year. This was checked actually last month. And a large portion of those cities also apply further subsidy. So if you've ever been to the US, this is a map of a bunch of cities that happen to be subsidized all throughout. Some big cities that you might have heard of would be like Saranac Lake, which is where the Lake Placid Olympics happened, and all around Moab, Utah, beautiful place to go. A lot of these cities, because of their distance from economic hubs, rely on a subsidy from the government. So I asked some further questions because the type of aircraft that are being used are pictured here. Small 9-seater aircraft up to 30-seat jets, even up to 50 actually in some cities. And I asked, can these be done without a subsidy? What does it take for it to be profitable? And further, we're having electric aircraft come into play. And how does electrifying these change the cost per available seat mile, which is how we measure the cost to operate these. This is on basically simple math for that once it comes out, and I'll display that later. But applying new age electric aircraft into that, would it actually allow us to get rid of part of the subsidy? So parts of that is where are we now? The aircraft pictured here are 3 aircraft that are doing test flights. We have the Aviation Alice, the Beta CTOL, and the Magni X Cessna Caravan. These do lower the CASM as I applied new data, and we've gained new knowledge not only on these aircraft, but eVTOL aircraft, which are electric vertical takeoff and land. These are like, think helicopters that fly from ports and are able to travel within the cities. A way to think about this as well is if you've watched Star Wars and you've ever seen the Jedi Temple and you see all these vehicles flying along, that's going to be part of our future. And that's kind of what we're studying now is how can we apply that in an electric sense. So this is a bunch of math, and I know most people here do humanities, but from the math perspective, anything that's in the right 3 columns are new age aircraft, and anything to the left 3 are all the old aircraft that are using your normal petrol. And I basically took it and used Vernal, Utah, and applied that to Salt Lake City and said, this is an example market that we can show real numbers on how it's changed. And I was able to show the lowered costs. So we start looking at smaller for this because when you go to fly, we have what's called scheduled displacement, which is where you want to fly, but maybe the airline doesn't operate that at that certain time. So we can introduce more flights, but on a smaller aircraft to allow more possibilities for you to travel, which actually increases the demand of travel and allows the want of people to go because it's more convenient. So right now we see that we really get to 3 different kinds of operators. The 9 seats or less, 9 to 30 seats, and above 30 seats. These are 3 different regulations of operators. The bigger the aircraft, the more stringent their safety regulation is. For example, the smaller 9-seater aircraft only requires 1 pilot. As soon as you get to 30 seats or 50 seats, that requires 2 pilots. So these are in different types of certifications, such as a commercial certificate versus an airline transport rating. The larger aircrafts require both pilots to have an airline transport rating. So that's really where it comes into play, is the cost to actually operate these aircraft. And that was a huge factor as well in why going smaller saved costs. So here's kind of the future of what you're looking at. These are real examples of the aircraft flying. They're over our skies right now. The biggest one is the Magni X Caravan. That's an engine that can be placed on multiple different aircraft. The Aviation Alice is also flying, but they've gone through 4 different prototypes and certified all 4 prototypes. So we're trying to figure out where exactly they're going with that. And so new math will have to be done. But the Beta CTOL is based out of Burlington, Vermont, and they have 2 kinds of aircraft. They have one that can take off straight up and down, and one that operates just like a normal aircraft. And they're pivotal in this because they are the ones developing the chargers for electric aircraft, and they've done what's called the electric loop. So all of these dots are electric charging stations on airports or areas that are getting electric charging stations, and they're the ones that are becoming like the Tesla of the electric aircraft. So further electric aircraft are going to be able to use these chargers to adapt and actually charge themselves. And they've created what the electric loop so that they're always within range during aircraft testing of an electric charger. And you can see it takes up most of the East Coast. So yay us on the East Coast, we're way ahead of it. On the West Coast, we have the San Francisco Bay Area. Actually, is quite far and as far as the eVTOL structure of it. However, they are behind on the chargers, so they can get in the air, but staying in the air is a little rougher. And kind of applying all of the math and data, we were able to determine that, yes, it is possible. Certification of these aircraft are happening within 5 years. Some of them already are certified. They just need to be sent out to airlines. The airport infrastructure to actually build out these charging stations is very minimal. It's as simple as installing for the electric car version Tesla charging stations, and that's all these aircraft need. And it lowers cost on average by 30 to 40%. In this picture, you can see where we started with this, which was a simple helicopter in Los Angeles Airways, which operated from Los Angeles Airport to Santa Monica Airport, and we're able to transport passengers. To now we have what's called Global X, who are building out, and they're a new company that's starting up out of Miami and will be operating these to smaller cities in Miami. So this is all happening within the next 5 years, and it's exciting to see not only lower carbon emissions, but also the ability for travelers to come more and more and more. Thank you. Yeah. Wait, I'll let the show.
Thank you, Dalton. That was absolutely fascinating. Oh my goodness me. I'm so excited to ask tons of questions at the end of this. For now, let us hear about material legacies on Ashley's presentation.
Thank you so much to the Accepted Society Research Symposiums team for allowing me to present my research, Material Legacies, Medieval Tomb Sculpture of Portugal. My dissertation research explores tombs produced in the 13th through 15th century housed in monasteries and churches in places like Batea, Odiveias, and Alcobaça through the lenses of materiality, political and religious life, and audienceship in Portugal. Although individual tombs have been studied in articles, a comparative study of these tombs have never been undertaken in any language. And in her recent article, The Chivalric Tomb in 15th Century Portugal, Dr. Teresa Soli argues that tombs produced after 1426 in Portugal ushered in, quote, a new era in Portuguese funerary sculpture that reveals patrons' consideration of a future as well as a contemporary audience, evincing a preoccupation with viewership and a consciousness of historical value that transcends the usual commemorative impulse behind the creation of monumental tombs, end quote. While Sully is correct that 15th century tombs had a preoccupation with viewership and historicity, one of the central arguments of my dissertation is that this phenomenon was not new to the 15th century. Rather, the 15th century represents a sort of culmination point along a much larger continuum towards thinking of viewership of tombs and historicity that actually begins in the medieval era. Because for the two preceding centuries, tombs in Portugal were already being designed with viewership and this historical legacy in mind. For example, in this tomb of Pedro I, the angels that surround the king on top of his 14th century tomb look up at the viewer, but also appear to look up at the heavens, creating a shared spatial field between the tomb and those who look up at it. Viewer, Pedro, and the heavens are all implicated together, and the viewer is left in a bit of an intermediary position between their reverence for the king and their reverence for the heavens. Pedro had joining tombs built for himself and the love of his life, a woman named Inés Castro, who was brutally murdered by Pedro's father, who disapproved of the affair. After his father's death, once he took the throne, Pedro had her body exhumed and placed in the Alcobaça monastery across from his tomb, so that in the afterlife, the first thing they would see was one another. The tombs both contain the inscription Até o fim do mundo, meaning until the end of the world. Everything about these tombs, from their placement in a prominent monastery to the moving of Inés's body from her former resting place in Coimbra to the Alcobaça monastery, the facing of the tombs, the shared motifs and materials that cross both tombs, etc., suggests that Pedro was, in fact, obsessive about how he wanted history to remember his relationship with Inés. While his father may never have approved of the relationship to the point that he had Inés assassinated by 3 men, Pedro wanted to ensure that history would remember him primarily as having been loved by and as having loved this woman, Inés Castro. And this kind of misconception about medieval tomb sculpture and about the consciousness and conscious creation of legacy and historicity in medieval Portugal is pretty common amongst the limited Anglophone scholarship that exists about art production in medieval Portugal. Although Portugal has received increased attention in early modern studies owing to the country's importance in the slave trade and the colonization of Africa and South America, the same cannot be said for the country's treatment in medieval studies. Most of the work on this era has been produced by Portuguese art historians, largely for a local audience in Portuguese. Often, this has left the country's contributions to medieval art relegated as provincial and peripheral to art production in places like Spain, Flanders, and England. One of the main concerns of my dissertation is to help reorient Portugal's place within the larger discussion of tomb sculpture that has been had over the last 5 to 10 years in art history as a discipline, to show that Portugal was actually a very well-connected, very well-networked art producer very well aware of the latest developments in sculpture and producing works that were in line with these commemorative impulses towards historicity and viewership, not just in the contemporary moment that they were in, but far into the future. And some questions that I'm currently exploring include what practical and psychosocial factors influence the selection of material for Portuguese tombs. How were Portugal's political aims, especially those connected to the Vatican, reflected in medieval tomb sculpture? And how did medieval tomb sculpture employ religious motifs to demonstrate personal political agendas? Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. I am blown away already. First couple of presentations, and I'm just absolutely floored. So we're going to take a couple of minutes for people to ask questions. Feel free to pop any questions that you have in the chat, or to raise a hand, come off mute, and we will limit this to 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes, if that's okay. So we've got a question in the chat from Ellis. How did you all come to your research topic and find original research queries? Dalton, can I ask you to jump in on your first, on the first question?
Yeah, how did you all come to the research topic and find original research queries? So, the Vernal Airport commissioned a study for my professors, and they had done it in 2020, and it was placed on a bookshelf gathering dust. And I read it, and then I was like, wait, this could be not only broader, but this can be brought into the new electric aircraft that are being certified. So I said, well, do you think electric aircraft can lower the cost? And my supervisor looks at me on Zoom and goes, you figure that out. And that's how I got as professors love to do. So that's kind of how I ran into my research topic.
I love that. I love that. I think that's so interesting. For me, for my research topic, unfortunately, Ashley's not with us, so I can't ask her about hers, because I would love to figure out how the tombs in Portugal came to be an idea that she ended up presenting on, but we will pass the question on to her and get her to contribute in the forum. But for me, it came about, essentially, I was reading Woman in the Picture, and it was talking about the Venus portraits around virginity, and then talking about religious portraits around maternal images, and how the way that feminine images essentially are either one or the other. It's either about sexuality and chastity, or about being maternal, and there's kind of nothing in between. And so it kind of got me thinking during one of my residencies, where we were talking about Elizabeth. And then I kind of thought, well, her portraits aren't exactly sexual. They kind of are, and are they kind of maternal? Not really. And then that's kind of where the idea sprung from, which is great. Thank you so much. Next question from Barbara. I really wish I had my glasses. For what ways might contemporary gender dynamics impact the way we analyze these portraits today? 100% great question. I absolutely love that. So I think the idea is that we are still seeing a lot of these prevalent images of either just virginity versus maternal images even today. And that's actually why I included the picture of Beyonce for the thank you, is because she utilizes these images even today in publication. The idea being that they are so subsumed into our perception of women in not only art, but in literature and in history, that we're not even conscious of them. So Beyonce cleverly plays into these images. She's done it for Venus so many times. So many sort of so many advertising agencies utilize these images all the time. and they just, this is so sort of subconsciously centered into our brain that we don't even recognize them. And by taking back that gaze, I suppose the purpose of my presentation was to take back the gaze and put it back onto the narrative itself. Let's see, Dalton, is there a government or big company project who is also financing the project? Also, can it be used for private use?
So the original study was funded by the Airport Commission to further their air travel, I guess. And then from me, I basically took at it and I said, if I created data, could private companies actually use it and create whole businesses? Technically, if you wanted to take my data, you could go start yourself an airline, a very small rural airline, and it would effectively be able to be used in your business plan. So that was kind of the idea behind it. I will not be doing that, but if you want the data, it's there. So.
I love that. Thank you. Cecilia asked, in what ways do you think Elizabeth's portraits are meant to remind or help forget Elizabeth's connections to Anne Boleyn and her parents' affair? It's actually very fascinating. I don't have a picture of this portrait of Elizabeth, but there is a portrait of Elizabeth where she is wearing on her clothing. Again, the whole idea of Elizabeth's clothing is very, very purposeful, which is what I kind of alluded to in the 5 minutes. Is that the way there is a portrait where she is wearing the particular emblems of the Boleyn family. And it is, it's a big, like, essentially middle finger to the whole sort of trying to ignore the connections and emblems and portraits, particularly in women's clothing, was a means for them to get across those messages in a more subtle way. And that was particular, especially with like the idea of the busk point as an emblem itself, as an emblem in and of itself. We had another one for you, Dalton. Do you believe the expansion of electric small planes will reduce the carbon footprint of the celebrities using private flights?
Oh, great question. Since most celebrities use their jets, the smaller aircraft that are getting electrified are going to be more for your like quick business flights that are pretty local. But anything that's like larger, such as Kim Kardashian, that's more of a like jet, and they haven't found a way to effectively electrify jets yet, just because the weight of batteries.
Fantastic. And then one more for you, Dalton. Is there a reason the eastern part of the states is in the forefront?
Just so the company Beta is actually a really cool company. You can go visit if you're ever in Burlington, Vermont. They have a giant rainbow flag hanging in their hangar, and you can just pull on up to the hangar and get a tour. And they are the leaders of the charging stations and building those. And most companies have agreed as part of a consortium that they can actually use the same charging adapters, and Beta was testing their aircraft in the East Coast and trying to make sure that it stayed within range of charging stations. So that's kind of why it's been the forefront of it. Although most electric aircraft are based in Silicon Valley, like the companies are, the Beta is leading it on the East Coast and with their headquarters there. That's why.
All right, you've still got a few more, so fasten your seatbelts there. Are the public aware of these subsidies? I certainly wasn't, although I'm not American. What is the financial climate looking like for expanding the reach of electric planes?
So the people who populate the cities which are subsidized are aware, because there's public commentary that they can like put in, and they get to choose their company that gets the subsidy every cycle, which is offset among all the cities, and it's usually every 4 years. And so they get to vote and say, I actually want this company versus that company, and it's usually either city council or the airport commission. So if you're really involved in your local politics in your small town, that's how you would know what's going on, or if you fly a lot. And then for as far as like expanding the reach of electric planes, the range is getting further and further, but it's just the weight of batteries that's going to hold everything back, because batteries weigh more than fuel. And so weight and everything for an aircraft is what limits its range.
And great question. Have you presented this to Elon?
Weirdly enough, do I have ways to contact him? Yes, I do. I have friends that have been like in his HR department, but I have not presented it. So I have
Okay.
friends that worked for the Boring Company, which are building those tunnels. And I think he left now, but he has his phone number. But no, Elon does not know about it.
It's a pity, because I think you might really snatch onto a project like this, quite honestly.
Well, if you want to work with him.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I don't want to ask what your friends were in HR for.
Different question.
It's a different. That's not related. I think we'll do one more question. Addressing the gap in research on Elizabeth that you've examined, what challenges did you find in researching your topic, if any, since Elizabeth is widely studied? That's actually the biggest challenge that I did find, is that there is already a lot of research in this area on Elizabeth, on her portraits, and on the icons that are found in her portraits, but they are majority taken from a male standpoint, where it doesn't examine this gap that we are seeing in the gaze, questioning the gaze itself, and questioning the viewer's view of what we are putting, what we are implanting our desires on to the portrait itself. So it was very difficult. The one really difficult thing about the paper was to try and say, well, why am I saying something completely new? And believe me, I went back and forth on that a lot. So gaze. Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much. I think we're going to move on. We actually are running so not ahead of time, but so on time, which is
a rarity.
A rarity. So thank you so much for our first set of panelists. We are going to move on to Lauren. Lauren, do you want hosting privileges to share your presentation?
Yes, I think I have them. So just give me 1 second.
No problem. Take your time.
Is that viewable?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to share my dissertation research with everyone. It's still in the process of taking formation, so I'm like really open to any feedback that anyone might have. The title of my dissertation is Survivor Affects: Aesthetic Mediations on Trauma and Healing in 21st Century Contemporary Culture. And at its core, my dissertation seeks to explore the affective dimensions of survival and healing in relation to gendered experiences of rape and abuse. Through a conceptual and depersonalized assemblage of theoretical approaches, I aim to investigate the complex structure of feelings generated around the figure of the survivor in the public imaginary. More specifically, I analyze contemporary installation artworks alongside autobiographical narratives by survivors to chart what I have begun to call survivor affects. That is, particular feeling states that are embodied in the aftermath of a traumatic event and that are implemented as a way of coping with / navigating life post-trauma. Survivor affects are experienced not just by survivors themselves, but also by the witnesses and audiences of the selected texts and installations included in my study. Together, they constitute a collective repertoire of effective responses to the experience of sexualized harm. Derived from Cian Nagai's offering of ugly feelings, survivor affects are ambivalent and ambiguous, resisting traditional binaries of positive and negative emotions. I further define survivor affects as a category of affective experiences that resist easy categorization and often fall outside the realm of traditionally acknowledged emotions. Like ugly feelings, I characterize survivor affects by their ambivalence, discomfort, and resistance to straightforward interpretation or expression, thus complicating contemporary narratives of healing. And I argue that survivor affects are marked by their unresolved and ongoing nature. They persist without providing a clear outlet or sense of closure. And importantly, this is not a study of how survivors feel post-trauma, but rather what people create and produce in order to survive, in order to keep on living in the aftermath of traumatic experience. In my dissertation, I argue that survivor affects may be experienced and or perceived as uncomfortable because their inherent ambivalence poses a threat to normative neoliberal healing discourses. These discourses tend to structure trauma and healing in reductively binaristic either or kinds of ways. And these kind of neoliberal narratives are perpetuated by the media, where sexual violence is continually framed and reframed as individual pathologized issue versus a systemic one. To complicate this further, there's the added concern when it comes to looking at images of trauma, of the hypervisibilization of sexualized harm that often enters into the conversation, especially through mainstream media platforms that often spectacularize acts of sexual violence or feed into an overarching sense of voyeuristic fascination. In fictional film and television narratives, for example, the ongoing reliance upon rape as a plot point reflects a normalization and even a celebration of sexual violence against women. This works to drastically obscure and even more problematically universalize the way sexual trauma and the subsequent task of healing is understood in contemporary society. I argue that the politics of representation in the context of trauma is in crisis, at once demanding yet protesting its recognition. In an effort to speak against these hegemonic discourses of recovery or commemoration, I theorize survivor affects and how they circulate in the public sphere as a way of bridging the individual with the collective and the public with the private. So to anchor my exploration, I look to visual and textual examples of experiences of trauma from contemporary culture to better understand how these inchoate affective states are materialized in aesthetic and emotional experiences. And the way that my dissertation is structured, I have a chapter on contemporary visual art, including this installation work by Lucien Hill entitled Retracing the Traits, as well as this installation by Andrea Bowers entitled Courtroom Drawings, Steubenville Rape Case Text Messages Entered as Evidence. Looking more towards the genre of feminist memoir, I draw upon the New York Times bestselling author Chanel Miller's Know My Name, as well as Michelle Bowdler's manifesto Is Rape a Crime? And then additional chapters include an analysis of the graphic novel Our Little Secret by Emily Carrington, as well as explorations of public artworks such as Jamie Black's The Red Dress Project and Emma Sulkowitz's mattress performance, Carry That Weight. So, not an empirical or sociological study, my research is grounded in the conceptual and discursive engagement with these aforementioned cultural materials, and I engage with these works as a way of analyzing how they articulate and challenge prevailing discourses on trauma and recovery, and to investigate the role of art and narrative in troubling notions of empathy, solidarity, and social change. Through this multidisciplinary archive of cultural objects, the concept of survivor affects serves as an interpretive avenue for exploring and understanding affective experiences that do not fit neatly into the emotional spectrum of mainstream healing discourses, while also probing at tensions of witnessing and testimony in relation to traumatic experiences and the role that memory plays in how these affects circulate in and between bodies. Through this collective archive, our theorization of the aftermath of sexualized harm can can transcend the realm of reductive diagnostic categories and can evolve into a complex human experience that defies rigid categorizations and is generative of a more nuanced comprehension beyond the confines of clinical psychologizing and memorializing discourses. By calling for a reconceptualization of trauma, not as a static and pathologizing diagnosis located within the individual, but rather a dynamic product of sociocultural and systemic forces, I wish to explore the representation and cultural production of trauma-based subject matter as interdisciplinary avenues where social justice, cultural production, and healing can converge. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I believe, Ash, you are up next. Do you need sharing privileges? Ah, you got it.
I got it, yeah. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good day wherever you are. I'll try to keep it short, but no promises. I am Ash. I'm a almost third-year PhD student at Memorial University of Newfoundland in Canada. I was looking at the presentations today, and I believe mine is the only health services research presentation. So I would like to focus more on the aspects of health services research so that you get an idea of what the current state of healthcare system in Canada is. So my research is focused on patient experience of care in emergency departments. Right off the bat, this is part of a larger initiative called Surgicon, which is an intervention that has been implemented in Newfoundland to improve patient experience of care. So whatever I'm presenting today is from the control period of that project. So this is the baseline data that we will be comparing to the intervention to see if we actually improved patient experience, right? So first of all, this is a patient-oriented research, which basically means that we involve patients as partners in research instead of just participants. So there's a difference that in a way that we give patients power, as much power as us researchers wherever possible. This is a recent developed area of research because at the end of the day, we are doing healthcare research for the patients, right? So it's always important to have their input to make sure that our resources are spent doing research that at the end of the day meet their needs and expectations, or in other words, provide patient-centered care. So far, we know that timely care, shared decision-making, consistent communication, and relationships with healthcare providers shape care experience. The caveat here being patient experience is very, very subjective. What I perceive as good experience is not going to be what any of you perceive as good experience, right? So even though this is a very important aspect of healthcare research, it's very, very difficult to study to the point where we are always studying this no matter what. Right? So our research aims to explore patient experience of care in emergency departments of Newfoundland and Labrador. This is the very first research to have been performed in NL. So no other previous study has been performed in NL. This is a cross-sectional study, which is a simple design that allows us to study the strength of relationship between different factors. So one aspect of patient-oriented research is presenting research in a patient-friendly way. That's why you'll see I have like definitions everywhere because we have to provide research outputs that are as accessible as possible. Now, the research was done in 4 EDs of NL, 2 rural and 2 urban emergency departments. Data was collected from 1st March 2021 to 27 July 2023. The data was collected using a telephone survey that was developed with the patient. So we asked the patients, what do you want us to ask you, right? So all the questions, all the answers are patient reported, as well as the questions are catered to patients' needs. A research assistant contacted all the patients who visited the EDs within 48 hours of discharge to collect the answers, and then a team of 5 researchers did a thematic analysis to get the themes and patterns present in the data. This is predominantly actually a very quantitative research, but I'm only showing you the qualitative part. I'll be happy to talk about the math. I love math later, but today I'm only presenting the qualitative parts. So the results, the fun part, we had 837 participants complete the survey during the study period. We identified 6 key themes, which I want to focus on. First one is emergency department environment. So patients were talking about how the chairs were not comfortable, the stretchers were not comfortable, ED was too crowded, washrooms were not clean, and etc., right? So overall, a bad emergency department environment equal to a bad patient experience. Now, patient-centered care has different aspects of care, starting with shared decision making. So patients were like, the doctor just told me something and then they were like, get out. So there was no involvement of the patient in the decisions about their care plan. And then there was, if you look at the first quote, it will talk about how the patient was not treated with any respect of empathy. So the patient felt like they were just rushed. The doctor was just ticking off a box like, I saw you, now get out. So patients were not, they felt rushed. They didn't feel like they were treated as a human. And then following wait times, if you have paid attention to any news about healthcare in Canada, you'll see that the wait times have been horrendous. You can quote me on this because I do know that. So patients are very frustrated with how long they have to wait in the ED. If you look at the last quote, it will talk about how to the point where patients have lost trust in the healthcare system and they're worried that if they go to the ED, even if they do go on time, they're still going to die because they're not going to get the care on time, which is terrible because emergency departments are supposed to serve the patients, but patients are worried that it's just going to kill them instead. And that's terrible, which leads us to the systemic issues, the shortage of staff, the staff's not being trained to provide empathetic care, etc. Then healthcare safety, which is equally important and a part of systemic issue. If you look at the second quote, you'll see that the ED was too crowded that the patient had to remove her own IV. And I am a person who's trained to provide IV, but I am still scared to do it even after years of experience, right? So it's like to have a normal common patient take their own IV out is a very scary thing. And it shows how messed up our healthcare system is. And finally, access to care. This involves access to care in the ED, outside the ED, to the ED. So access to care to family physicians. When you don't have a family physician, you have to run to the ED every time you have a disease, which overcrowds the ED. When you have, for example, during the nights, there will be less staff. So radiology example is delayed. So all the patients at the night end up waiting till the morning to get their radiology results and stuff, right? And again, access to ED also involves equity in care. So disabled patients or neurodivergent patients not having enough care or appropriate care because it's not catered to their needs. So there's an accessibility issue of those kind of patients as well. So as you can see from the codes, these are the issues that are currently leading to a negative patient experience of care in emergency departments. It's in Newfoundland and Labrador, but I can go on a limb here and say that it's actually across Canada. This is very generalizable across Canada. And as you can see, our patient research partners agreed that our results actually do convey their lived experience. So every time, again, being a patient-oriented research, every time we generate a result, we go to our patient partners and be like, is this what you're experiencing? Are our results correct? Are we actually telling people what you're experiencing? And they agreed that, yes, this is the state of our healthcare system and we need to change it. So how are we going to change it? Yeah, so our study basically showed that environment, patient-centered care, lengthy wait times, systemic issues, healthcare safety, and access to care shapes patient experience of care in EDs of NL. But just having this information is not enough, right? So we already have an intervention that is aimed to improve the experience of care in emergency department. But along with that, these results directly go to stakeholders like NL Health Services executives who are part of our team, and we will be like, hey, these are the issues and this is how you can fix it. Starting from fixing the chairs in your emergency department to training the healthcare providers to provide accessible and empathetic care. We basically hold their hands every step of the way to redesign the health system and improve emergency departments across Canada, but starting with Newfoundland and Labrador. And finally, as we are redesigning a health system in collaboration with patient partners, one of the biggest goals of Canadian healthcare is to integrate health evidence into health decision making. So we are actually partnering with the patients to know what they want and then do the research, show the evidence, and then integrate it into decision making so that at the end of the day, our healthcare system is completely patient-centered. Thank you. I finished.
Thank you so much, Ash. That was absolutely fascinating, and I think there is so much that we can learn from that. Next, we have Sarah's presentation.
Hi, my name's Sarah Binks. I'm a PhD candidate from the Department of Social Work in the Melbourne School of Health and Sciences at the University of Melbourne in Victoria, Australia. And I'm here today to talk about my research, and I'm looking specifically into school social work practice in Australia. And the first phase of my research is looking specifically at the barriers and facilitators to school social work practice more broadly. And so the information I'm presenting today is adapted from the first journal article published as part of my PhD research with my co-authors that was published in the British Journal of Social Work in April of 2024. So this scoping review is, like I said, the first phase of my research that aims to understand how school social workers thrive in school communities in Australia, specifically when they're faced with barriers to social work practice in the school setting. So we know that school social workers provide psychosocial and mental health interventions to students and their families to overcome such educational barriers and inequities. It's important that we study and understand the barriers and facilitators to effective school social work practice, given the impact that these barriers have on service provision and on the social workers themselves. For the methods of our scoping review, we followed the PRISMA SCR methodology and incorporated the Peters PCC approach. So our population was social workers providing services in school settings. Our concept was to look at social workers' perceptions of barriers and facilitators to school social work practice. And our context was to look at 5 different countries. So that was Australia, Aotearoa, New Zealand, Canada, the UK, and the USA. And we looked specifically at those social workers working in schools from K to 12. We included only English language resources. They were academic peer-reviewed and literature and chapters in edited books. Our date range was limited to January 2000 up to February 2022. Our study selection, we looked at 7 different academic databases, and we had returned over 14,000 records. Now, it was at that stage that we realized that we did not want to limit our search criteria further, given that the potential to introduce bias. And so my supervisors and I made the decision that we needed to assemble a team, and that's the team that became my co-authors, to really focus on helping me with the screening process. So being the lead author and the PhD student, I had to screen everything, and
articles were divided amongst my co-authors to spread the load. Thankfully, we used the Covidence software. I cannot speak highly enough of Covidence software. And so we were able to screen over 14,000 records at title and abstract screening level. And looking at our inclusion and exclusion criteria, we reduced that number to 285 that required full text article screening. And from that full text article screening, we then were able to identify 42 studies that met the inclusion criteria to be included in our scoping review. So the key findings from those 42 articles was grouped into 5 different themes. So the themes were inadequacy of service delivery infrastructure. And I've included examples there for you to read along with. I've school social work. Another theme was school social workers' role ambiguities and expectations. School social workers' competencies, knowledge and support. School climate and context. And cultivating relationships and engagement. And it was from these themes that I've now developed the focus and the rest of my PhD research. And I've decided to focus in on one of these particular themes, which is around school social workers' competencies, knowledge, and support. So what we found with this scoping review to explore what the existing evidence was out there in these 5 countries, and what we found was that barriers were much more extensively reported than facilitators in the existing research, and that research was predominantly from the US. And so we found that there is a need for more research specifically focused on the facilitators. What are the things that actually help school social workers in practice to overcome and address these barriers that have been identified? And so for my PhD study, I'm looking at an exploratory sequential mixed methods approach. It has 2 phases. Phase 2 is a qualitative interviews with up to 15 Victorian participants. And my aim is to understand the competencies required and the strategies employed by those social workers to address barriers to their school social work practice in schools. And then my 3rd phase is to extend what we find in phase 2 to have an online survey extended to 50 Australian participants at least, to identify what is the prevalence and preparation of school social workers across Australia in utilising these strategies and competencies. And so the overall aim is the development of practical school social work guidelines to support new and existing school social workers so that they can feel comfortable, confident and capable to address barriers that they face on a day-to-day basis when they're delivering social work practices in schools. Thank you very much. They're my references, and I'd love to talk more about my research if anyone has questions. Thank you.
Thank you all very, very much. I think all of that research was absolutely so fascinating. Just conscious that we are now running quite a bit behind, which is absolutely fine. So I'm just going to do 5 minutes of questions, please, for Ash and Lauren, and any questions for Sarah will get to her if there are anything in the chat. To Ash, what are the ongoing challenges faced by ERs in Canada, and what future improvements are being considered?
There's a lot of challenges when it comes to staff shortages, which are kind of leading to the rest of the challenges. So because there aren't sufficient nurse practitioners, nurses, or physicians in Canada, it's kind of difficult to provide patient-centered care. So how we are kind of trying to fix it is through the physician shortage fixing. It's going to take some time, but the rest of the things we're kind of going into the EDs, trying to fix little things, like, for example, making the ED more comfortable, because even when there's long wait time, if you have a comfortable ED to sit and relax on, patients are more satisfied. And I've personally seen comments where patients waited for 12 hours, but the physician was so nice to them that they said, it's great, everything was great, I don't care, I got the care I needed, right? So we're trying to fix the little things that add up to the big things, if that makes sense.
Fantastic. Lauren, a question for you. What discipline your research falls under, because it seems quite interdisciplinary?
Yeah, it is quite interdisciplinary, and that's like a struggle that I've come up against a lot, just because I feel like I've like positioned my research like right at the juncture of humanities and social sciences, which methodologically they don't always speak in great dialogue with each other. But I come from a background in art history, and so I think a lot of my study is grounded in visual analysis and like visuality. And then I've since starting my PhD kind of expanded more into the genre of feminist autobiography and feminist life writing studies. So it's definitely kind of has a foot in both doors of social sciences and humanities.
Fantastic. Just again, conscious of time. So I know there are a couple more questions in the chat for you all. If you wouldn't mind just having a look at those and maybe replying directly in the chat. I think we need to move on to our next group of panelists, which I think Madeline is first up. Madeline, are you on the call?
Yep.
Yes,
Yep.
amazing.
Let me just share real quick. Okay, 1 second. Okay, awesome. Can you all see that? Great. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm excited to be here. My name is Madeline. I'm a second-year PhD student in history at Cornell, and I study modern Spain, and thematically, I study fascism. So I'm really interested in questions of illiberalism and the international order. And I'll kind of start off with a base understanding that we all have, which is most people are aware that after the Ally-initiated efforts to get rid of Italian and German fascism and their legacies after the Second World War. But amidst all of the efforts to remove these traces of fascist rule from post-war Europe, General Francisco Franco sat unperturbed in Spain. He was still officially dictator of Spain, a position he would keep for the next 30 years until his death in 1975. And it was not until Spain's path to democratization over the years after Franco's death that the West would begin to ask itself, how did this happen? And I want to take us back to the interwar period and start with the League of Nations. I think this is a central point to understand what the world order was after World War I and going into World War II when fascist powers were established on the continent. So after the defeat of the major empires in the First World War, it was essential to set up an international system of diplomacy, economic order, and law to serve as an active mediator to territorial disputes and regional conflict. To accomplish this, the League developed a charter that contained a variety of articles meant to adjudicate conflicts, among other things, among member states and their colonies. The most important for my consideration is Article 11, and I won't read it all out to you, but the important part is that first part of Section 1, which says that any war or threat of war, whether immediately affecting any of the members of the League or not, is hereby declared a matter of concern to the whole League, and the League shall take any action that may be deemed wise and effectual to safeguard the peace of nations. So the League was really concerned with restoring peace on the European continent and the globe broadly, but also wanted to maintain the power of its leading nations, especially the imperial and global control of Britain and France, to ensure that violent conflict throughout the globe didn't extend beyond smaller regional disputes, and most notably, didn't break out on the European continent itself. So under this article, the League adjudicated several incidents throughout the 1920s, and it was seemingly effective in its ability to prevent the escalation of conflict on a larger international and continental scale. In 1936, however, the larger latent violence of the interwar period came home to roost in Spain. Spain was already politically unstable and engaged in a fervor of a popular front government, which became the center of European attention. In 1936, the nationalist powers attempted a military coup led by General Francisco Franco and turned on the Republican government. The conflict soon escalated into an all-out civil war, forcing the European international community to reckon with the politics of war, violence, and intervention. So in the historiography today, the war is accepted as part of a broader international conflict that almost marks the start of the outbreak of violence of the Second World War. But at the time of its impetus, the time that it was going on, and in the years right after the war, it was really framed as this purely domestic internal affair. There were no international powers involved. I think it's essential to study this within the ideology of a global fascist cause, where domestic affairs necessarily became wrapped up in this larger world of foreign affairs. So through a lens of international history and law, these are necessarily crucial not only for understanding the civil war in Spain itself, but for the entire implications of fascist regimes and their place in modern Europe, and the conflict between the idea and reality of European liberalism and internationalism. So the first part of my research, and this is kind of the first part of a three-part dissertation I'm developing, is focused on the ways in which the liberal international order under the League of Nations was designed by the British and French to avoid this violent conflict, as I've already said. As war broke out in Spain, the British formulated a specific novel non-interventionist policy towards Spain, distinct from previous policies of neutrality in foreign conflict. Together with a begrudging French government, they designed the Non-Intervention Treaty in 1937, which they had 22 countries sign, and changed the liberal international order's relationship to Spain, and essentially allowed General Franco to establish his dictatorship and continue unchallenged. So neutrality is different than non-intervention in the ways that neutrality involves a commitment to avoid alliances and a distinct refusal to align with both belligerent and non-belligerent sides. So it creates legal distinctions on the sides of a conflict. Because this was designated under non-intervention, it meant that neither sides were belligerents and international law didn't apply to the things done by either side. This has distinct implications on the end results after the Civil War. It contributed to the brutal crackdown by Franco on former Republicans after the nationalists won the war, and to the totalizing nature of the fascist regime on domestic life. So because the foreign policy in the international community's ideological commitment to non-intervention contributed to this repressive nature, given the nationalist fascist government, it didn't have to reckon with any legal ramifications of wartime atrocities that they committed. So instead of the traditional view, I'm examining this as part of a new post-Versailles liberal ideology with implications on fascist domestic policy within Spain itself and a broader fascist world-making, as I'm calling it, the German, Italian, and Spanish attempts to take over the continent. So non-intervention is not a failure of the great powers to act, as other scholars of the Spanish Civil War have framed it. I do not view non-interventionist policy as merely meant to succeed or fail in resolving the conflict, but instead it was an ideology of the status quo, meant to maintain a very unstable peace on the continent. And it was another form of liberal internationalist impact on the legal ramifications of warfare that would carry over into the post-war and Cold War era. So just kind of to conclude, this begs the question of whether or not any conflict that firmly operates within these camps of civil war can be considered a necessarily international conflict. Certainly, the fascist international project saw the domestic situation in Spain as essential to not only its own project, but to the Spanish project and to recapturing Europe from Bolshevism and communism. A defeat of communism in Spain would not simply be accomplished through the defeat of the Republican government, but by a totalizing, taking into an integration of the domestic sphere within the politics of fascism. So the question remains whether Western calls for non-intervention were a form of implicit acceptance of fascist intervention or not. Again, this project is only the first part of a three-part dissertation on the status of Spain, the rationalization of fascist regimes, even after the defeat of other fascist powers on the continent, and later the Cold War context. So to conclude, the non-interventionist policy set the framework for the ways that the international liberal order would view Spain from 1936 until 1975. Happy to answer questions after, and thank you all.
Thank you so much, Madeline. All right, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Lainey.
What am I doing wrong? Oh, share.
Yeah, just go into system preferences.
Thank God you're here.
Yeah, I'm just gonna make sure that Zoom can do its thing. Can you use your finger?
Okay. Later. Cool. Hang on. Let's go back to Zoom land. Share your screen. And off you go.
All right. Hi, everyone. Sorry about that. I was born in the 1900s, so I have no idea what I'm doing. So today we're going to discuss Cotton Mather and how he used George Burroughs as a scapegoat. Reverend George Burroughs served as minister in Salem Village from 1680 to 83, but his time there was marked by conflict due to existing factionalism. When he left, many of the village elite viewed him as an adversary. Despite being gone for 9 years, Burroughs became a central figure in the witchcraft accusations. That began in 1692. Cotton Mather, prominent minister familiar with witchcraft, the 1688 execution of Van Glover, saw Burroughs's trial as a chance to steer New England toward God's providence. In this presentation, I will explore George Burroughs' role in the Salem witch trial, Cotton Mather's influence on his trial and execution, Mather's role in the cover-up, and his failings as a religious leader. Using trial transcripts, Mather's writings, and other period accounts, I will demonstrate how the misuse of spectral evidence undermined the legal process and caused conflict within the colony. Additionally, I will reveal how Mathers ensured Burroughs' conviction and execution and how he acted in bad faith to protect himself and the legislature. In February 1692, at the home of the Salem village minister, daughter Betty and niece Abigail began having violent fits. By early 1693, 200 people in Massachusetts had been accused, including the governor's wife. The accusations led to 19 hangings, one person being pressed to death, multiple deaths in jail, including a child who was released with lasting psychological damage. On April 30th, 1692, a formal complaint against Reverend George Burroughs was filed by Thomas Putnam Jr. and Jonathan Walcott. George Burroughs was born in England and raised in Roxbury, Mass. He graduated from Harvard in 1670, became minister in Falmouth, Maine, until King Philip's War in 1676 forced evacuation. In 1680, he became the minister in Salem Village, but due to factionalism, he was not paid. After his wife's death in 1681, he had to borrow money from John Putnam for funeral expenses. In 1683, still unpaid, Burroughs left Salem for Casco Bay. When he returned to settle accounts, Putnam had him jailed for the unpaid loan, but Burroughs was bailed out by supporters and left for Maine. 9 years later, Burroughs was arrested as a suspected wizard and accused of performing baptisms for the devil, possessing supernatural strength, domestic violence, and murdering his wives and the family of a fellow minister. Abigail Hobbs, a confessed witch, claimed he attended witch meetings in Salem Village, likely sending his specter from Casco Bay. On April 21st, 1692, Thomas Putnam Jr. wrote to the magistrates John Hawthorne and Jonathan Corwin, describing George Burroughs as a wheel within a wheel, suggesting the devil was working through him as a minister. Burroughs' trial raised concerns about fairness. Elijah Hutchins signed Burroughs' warrant, unlike other cases, and Putnam's formal complaint wasn't filed until April 30th, leading to suspicions of collusion. During the trial, contradictions in testimonies, and Putnam Jr. claimed Burroughs stabbed his first wife, while Susanna Shelton said he smothered her. Those testimonies were ignored, or the contradictions were ignored. Ben Hutchinson testified for Abigail Williams without her corroboration. Increased Mather, Cotton Mather's father, attended Burroughs' trial, the only one he attended, with Cotton noting it in a letter. Ministers were usually exempt from witchcraft accusations, but Burroughs' position seemed to fuel them. 20 ministers or their family members were accused, including Samuel Willard, Increased Mather's rival. George Burroughs was the only minister executed, and the accusations continued even after his death. On August 19, 1692, George Burroughs and 4 others, Martha Carrier, John Proctor, George Jacobs, and John Willard, were hanged. As Burroughs stood on the ladder, he declared his innocence with a speech that impressed the crowd by ending by reciting the Lord's Prayer, which he considered proof of innocence for accused witches. However, Cotton on horseback dismissed Burroughs' prayer, stating that even the devil could appear as an angel of light. The executions then proceeded without challenge. Cotton Mather, a third-generation minister in Boston and the son and grandson of prominent New England ministers, notably began at Harvard at age 12. Mather's lineage and precociousness positioned him as a leading theologian. Though not frequently mentioned in trial records, Mather was a key figure in the Salem witch trials. In a letter to John Richards, he advised not to overly rely on spectral evidence, yet he did not oppose its use, which became central to the trials. Despite his ongoing involvement, Count Mather became more prominent only after the trials. In early 1693, the Salem witch trials abruptly ended largely because Lady Phipps, wife of Governor Phipps, was accused of witchcraft. Throughout the trials, Phipps failed to inform the king and neglected to mention the court of Oyer and Terminer, which operated outside normal legal bounds. Residents were outraged, their loved ones were jailed or executed, and those released were not legally restored. Land was seized and not returned. Elizabeth Proctor, deemed dead in the law due to her conviction, was exiled by her stepchildren, and her petitions for reversal were ignored, as were those of the other victims. Judges began regretting their roles, especially Samuel Sewell, who spent the rest of his life atoning. Cotton Mather, at Governor Phipps' request, wrote Wonders of the Invisible World in 1693 to justify the trials. The book downplayed the reliance on spectral evidence and led to a ban on further publications about the trials. However, by defending the trials, Mather damaged his reputation in the colony, and even his later attempts to change his stance made little difference. In 1695, Salem merchant Thomas Mall wrote Truth Held Forth, criticizing the government's handling of the Salem witch trials. He was arrested and the book was banned. Mall's friend, Robert Caleb, posted bail and wrote More Wonders of the Invisible World, directly challenging Mather's actions. Caleb's book included court records, Cotton Mather's diary entries about Margaret Rule's 1693 afflictions, and letters where Caleb accused Mather of trying to identify Rule's tormentors. Rule's afflictions began after the Salem trials, with Mather often at her bedside. Caleb suggested that Mather's actions and influence over the girl were sexually inappropriate. Caleb also documented trial accounts, including evidence of reliance on spectral evidence, apologies from jurors, and letters from the accused. Caleb sourced much of his material from Thomas Brattle, a rival of Mather's. Though Mather dismissed the book as lies and tried to silence Caleb with a libel suit, the historical records support Caleb's account. Mather's biographer, Abijah Perkins Marvin, noted that questioning Mather's authority made it impossible to remain on good terms with him. In 1718, British minister Francis Hutchinson wrote an historical essay concerning witchcraft, arguing Cotton Mather's 1688 book about the Glover trial, memorable providence, contributed to the Salem witch trials by spreading fear and superstition. Hutchinson criticized Mather's portrayal of Anne Glover, an Irish woman who spoke little English, as a witch who afflicted the Goodwin children. Mather took the eldest Goodwin daughter, Martha, into his home to prove there were witches. This is the second of three instances where Mather showed a special interest in afflicted young women, the third being Mercy Short, a Boston girl affected during the Salem trials. Hutchinson may hint at Mather's inappropriate behavior, though he never accuses him. While there is no conclusive evidence of sexual intent, Mather certainly uses influence to manipulate these girls' illusions and assert his authority on witchcraft. The Puritan view of religious freedom resembled a theocracy with no toleration for non-Puritans. The execution of Charles I in 1649 allowed Massachusetts to dominate the region. The exile of Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson warned against challenging the Puritans. Tom Mall's book, Truth Held, criticized Puritan treatment of Quakers as well as the witch trials. Cotton Mather believed he was fulfilling a divine prophecy of a Puritan utopia, protecting the legislature, judges, and church after the trials with George Burroughs as a scapegoat. Mather wrote Wonders about Burroughs' trial, expressing regret in knowing him. Mather's account contained discrepancies such as accusations of biting and Burroughs transcribing from Thomas Addy's A Candle in the Dark. No trial records support these claims. While some details may be lost, Mather's account appears exaggerated and partly fabricated. George Burroughs was a private man and often an unlikable man, making him an ideal scapegoat for the Salem witch trials. However, being unlikable is not evidence of being a disciple of the devil. Burroughs and other executed victims deserve better from their neighbors and leaders. Perry Miller noted that increased Mather prioritized politics over theology, a trait also seen in Cotton Mather after the trials. Cotton Mather likely felt pressured to defend the trials to protect the colony's vision, but this cost him his credibility and influence. None of the accused during the Salem witch trials were guilty. They were victims of factionalism and political schemes. Ann Putnam Jr.'s 1706 confession before the Salem Village congregation highlighted the trial's scandalous nature and the innocence of the accused, admitting her role in the wrongful accusations influenced by satanic delusion. She sought forgiveness from God and the families affected. George Burroughs and other victims were exonerated in 1711. Thank you.
Excellent work. Lainey, would you just mind muting? Just worried it's going to have a bit of a loop. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to our final presenter of the day, Carmen.
Yeah, all right. Let's see here. All right, so hi everyone, my name is Carmen Collins. I'm a PhD candidate at St. John's University, and I'm currently in a program called Multi-Sector Communication. And this presentation is based on an article I wrote for European Judaism, based on the works of Martin Buber, who you see here. And the article is entitled Nurturing Empathy for a Better World. And so this has nothing to do with my dissertation, and it was kind of like a side project that I did, but I thought in today's climate, I thought it was something very timely and something that could be used and be applied to for in every sector of society. So I use Martin Buber's concept of I and thou to nurture empathy for future generations to come inside the classroom. And in a modern world where a class's progress is measured by data and the roboticization of learning, we propose the use of Socratic dialogue as it allows for empathy to flourish, not just for students, but for teachers as well. Learning through dialogue allows for everyone, both inside and outside the classroom, to learn how to have more empathy. And this type of pedagogy creates a humanized approach to learning through the establishments of relationships. The way a student perceives the world around them and the people in their life must be nurtured with empathy for a better world. So this is a quote from the article, and I'll read it out to you because I thought, having empathy, I see it as a teachable skill and not as an inherent trait. So understanding empathy as requiring reflective listening abilities to consciously attempt to unpack the story of the other, to distill the story and the meanings associated with the other. So Ich Du, he wrote this in German. I didn't read this in German because I don't speak German, unfortunately, even though my grandparents are German. But I wanted to talk about how Socratic dialogue and this idea of I and you, which Martin Buber says, you don't know who you are, like yourself as an individual person, until you talk to another person, right? So how do you know you're a person? Unless, you're in a society, you're in a community, and you talk to other people. And so I kind of saw that there's a convergence and complementarity with Socratic dialogue and this concept of Martin Buber, which if you haven't read, I really recommend that you read because it really helps you shape how you have relationships with other people. So first, I want to talk about Socratic dialogue. It's essential to acknowledge the limitations of direct sources on Socrates to better comprehend such dialogue. Instead, we have to rely on the writings of Xenophon, Aristophanes, and Plato to understand the essence of Socratic thought. Here in the article that I wrote, I specifically refer to Plato's Meno as a foundational text, justifying this choice by delving into the context of Platonic dialogue. And readers can gain a deeper understanding of the distinct account of dialogue presented by Socrates. Although Buber and Socrates approach dialogue from different angles, they converge in their emphasis on the significance of the teacher-student interaction. While Buber highlights the I-thou or I and you relationship, emphasizing the quality of connection and presence, Socrates seeks to guide his interlocutors towards self-discovery and the examination of their beliefs through critical inquiry. Both perspectives can be seen as complementary, covering distinct aspects of the teacher-student dynamic. So as I mentioned, I view empathy as a teachable skill. Just as we say, oh, racism is taught,
well, empathy and kindness can also be taught. And this is highly theoretical in nature. And this was something I kind of thought about as I go through my PhD program, because, you know, I have to be a teaching assistant. I'm helping teach others. And I find that sometimes, you know, students might feel just as like another number, another face in the classroom. And I feel like we don't really see the student as a human. And so I wanted to read this here, where it says, empathy defined here as both the capacity and desire to respect the lived experience of the other as equal to our own is not merely a type of emotion. It is actually a deep process of recognition and respect for the other. Pedagogy and its hierarchical structure is too quick to focus on what the teacher can teach. So here I say, you know, we really need to focus on what can we learn from each other. And the classroom is a representation of society. So you have people from diverse backgrounds, you know, they might not speak English, they might have learning difficulties, they might be from, you know, a different color skin. And so I really think that through teaching empathy using Socratic dialogue, such as following up questions, you know, saying, what do you mean by that? Can you explain? Having that method really allows for an establishment of human connection and fosters empathy. And so also I use Socratic dialogue because it's malleable. You can use it in any situation, in any classroom. You know, I think at the panel yesterday, we were talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think using empathy and thinking of it as a teachable skill will allow for better conversations. And, you know, like, what do you mean by that? Can you follow up and tell me like why you decided to teach the classroom in that way? And having respect for the other is really important. And that's pretty much it. I could go much more in depth, but I really wanted to share this research because I haven't been able to. And it's something that I've been thinking about as I continue my PhD journey. And if I want to teach in the classroom, I think it's really important to have a way to foster empathy, not just among myself, but among students and the community at large. So thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much, Carmen, Lainey, and Madeline. We're going to have about 5 minutes for Q&A, just being conscious of everyone's time. Kate, unfortunately, had to run off to go get the bus, so you're left with me for the rest of the day to moderate. So I'm just going to go ahead and keep an eye on the chat if we have any questions. All right. We have a few. Carmen, what would be your top tips, questions to ask others to best foster empathy in daily life?
Yeah, so this is actually a question I ask myself every day. So, you know, oftentimes when we are in difficult situations, we become defensive. So when someone says, oh, I don't like the way you teach, don't be like, well, that's not my problem, because it is your problem, right? I would, you know, wait a few seconds and say, well, can you expand on that? Can you explain what you mean? And don't ask it in a defensive voice, but ask it like, can you explain why you think this way? You know, just follow up with questions just to understand where that person is coming from. And it's mostly not a problem with you. It's just like, think of it as like an issue with like how that person perceives the issue at hand. So just ask follow-up questions. And if you feel like you're being attacked, wait a few seconds and then ask for an explanation. That would be my best tip. I hope that was helpful.
That's beautiful. Thank you. All right. Barbara asked Madeline, in what ways has Spain's experience under Franco shaped the country's current commitment to liberal democracy?
Yeah, this is a really great question because I think I'm deciding where to end the dissertation, and obviously 1975 when he dies feels not nearly enough. And so I think it's fascinating to me because a lot of the ministers that were ministers under Franco kind of just stay under the radar and continue on. And so there is that like direct political legacy. Larger implications for people who don't just care about Spain. I think I hear a lot about the rise of the right in Europe and kind of globally today. And my argument is kind of that like fascism and the far right never went away. It was always there. It was just that the West and international law, international politics ignored it and allowed it to continue unabated. So there isn't a sudden resurgence. It's just that we never stamped it out the first time. And so there is that tension in Spanish history today. And I think the people are kind of trying to reckon with that because there's still that deep, harsh legacy of it.
Thank you so much, Madeline. All right. Final question from Jen for Lainey. how much has Mather, how much was Mather's how much was Mather motivated by religion versus politics? It seems more from the latter, but I want your perspective.
I think Mather didn't know that he was influenced by politics at all. He really believed that he was doing God's work and that God was speaking to him, and like his internal monologue was coming from a higher place to tell him how to behave and how to act in these situations. And so I think it's one of those things where it highlights the dangers of believing that you understand deities, if you will, and you have to be very, very careful about how you approach it, especially if you are in a leadership role. So I don't think he really understood. I think he was actually really naive. I think he was an intelligent person, but he was put in a role, too much too soon, if you will. So when the witch trials came about, or these accusations came about, I think he got overly excited to kind of use these situations to stamp out evil, and he thought that that was the answer for New England becoming the power, the Puritan power that it was meant to be. And ultimately, I think that was his motivation. I think in hindsight, years later, he realized that he made a lot of mistakes and he tried to take him back, but it was already too late.
Thank you so much for your answer, Lainey. That's excellent. And I think an excellent way for us to go ahead and end off this year's accepted symposium and our research day. We are hoping to have the accepted symposium again early in August next year, back in Oxford. So any of you that would like to join us in person, mark your calendars. It'll probably be the second week in August, but we will confirm when we're a little bit further along. And I just want to say a special thank you to everybody on the team who made this possible, to Kate, to Cecilia, to Polly, who's sitting across from me, Kalia, Amber, Elijah, all of the people on the team who have made this feasible, and also all of you who have been here every day in order to support one another and to be members of Accepted Society or to join on the live stream. I just want to say just a very special thank you for being here, especially being on Zoom, giving up your weekend, traveling from far and wide in order to be with us in person. This has been such a special weekend, and the recordings and all these things are going to be available for all of you that are members. So just keep an eye. I'll have those out to you by tomorrow. And for those of you that are not currently members of Accepted Society, be sure to check out the link in the live stream and just check out a 7-day trial. Come join some of our study sessions, get to know the community, and we hope to see you over there. So please join us, and I will see you all very soon. Thanks, everyone.